We would like to provide a special thanks to Audible for supporting The Trail Went Cold, and we would both like to thank you, the listeners, for being such great supporters of this show. So to earn yourself a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial, please visit audible.com/cold. That's audible.com/cold. Thank you. November 8th, 1988. Botany Bay, Australia. A radio operator receives a call from Ken Jones, the skipper of a yacht called the Patanela, which is currently in the midst of a voyage to Airlie Beach. Ken claims that the boat has run out of fuel, but after a subsequent radio call is cut off, there is no more communication from the vessel. When the Patanela fails to arrive at its destination, a massive search comes up empty, and Ken Jones, his wife, and 2 crew members are never heard from again. Rumors would surface that the boat was hijacked, but aside from a life buoy and a message in a bottle from one of the crew members, no trace of the Patanela is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering a mystery from Australia involving a missing boat, the 1988 disappearance of a yacht called the Patanela. This is a request from an Australian listener named Fiona, and since I had never heard of this case at all before she brought it to my attention, thank you Fiona. We have a lot of listeners from Australia, and since I've only covered one Australian case on this podcast thus far, the disappearance of Eloise Worledge, I figured it was about time I go down under again. This will also be the first mystery we've covered involving a missing boat. Usually, the solution to these type of mysteries is pretty obvious, but there's a lot of strange stuff in this story to suggest it might not be a simple case of a boat sinking to the bottom of the ocean. It sounds like this mystery is fairly famous in Australia, but it's definitely not well known here in North America, so I was quite excited to delve into it. But before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and 15 to 20 minute minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it and leave us a rating or review because that will help us garner more exposure. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who's feeling generous and wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. We actually received a couple new donations this week from listeners named Christy, Carissa, and Mary. So thank you very much for your generosity. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the mysterious disappearance of the Patanela. Our story begins in Australia in 1988 and involves a 63-foot steel schooner named the Patanela. The boat has been around for several decades at this point and has a history of sailing long voyages around the world. Most famously, it was used for a 5-month expedition to Heard Island in Antarctica in 1964, captained by renowned explorer Bill Tillman. By now, the Patanela has pretty much been converted into a luxury yacht, but it is still in excellent seafaring condition. If you're wondering what the name means, the boat's original owner apparently chose it because he thought Patanela was a Tasmanian Aboriginal word for protective god. Well, apparently he was mistaken, and Patanela turned out to be a Tasmanian Aboriginal word for devil, which isn't too comforting and only makes me think of the Tasmanian devil. Anyway, the Patanela's current owner is Alan Nichol, a wealthy businessman from Perth who has had the boat for a few months. On October 16th, The Patanela is scheduled to begin a long voyage from the port city of Fremantle. The skipper will be 52-year-old Ken Jones, a skilled sailor who also hails from Perth and once competed in the famous yachting event, the Admiral's Cup. In addition to Alan Nicol, Ken will be joined on his journey by his 50-year-old wife Noreen and their adult daughter Rana Lee. The group will also be accompanied by a pair of aspiring sailors from the town of Taree, 23-year-old John Blissett and 21-year-old Michael Calvin. Believe it or not, the two men do not know the rest of the group that well. They just happened to see the Patanela at a yacht club one day and decided to approach Alan Nicol and ask if he would give them jobs as crew members on his boat. They were both trying to garner as many sailing hours as possible so they could eventually earn their navigational certificates, and this voyage would be a good opportunity for that. Apparently, Alan had also promised that they would be able to use the boat to help them start a charter business. And here's an interesting anecdote about Michael Calvin. He had recently worked as a set rigger on the movie Dead Calm, a thriller where Sam Neill and Nicole Kidman play a couple who are terrorized on their yacht by a psycho played by Billy Zane. Anyway, the Patanela was planning to travel from Fremantle to Airlie Beach, which is located in the state of Queensland, and the voyage was scheduled to last just over a month. In case you're not familiar with Australian geography, these locations are on opposite sides of the continent and over 5,000 kilometers apart by land. On October 29th, 13 days after beginning its voyage, the Patanela docked in Port Lincoln, which is located on the coast of South Australia. Alan Nicol had some business commitments he had to attend to, so he left the boat to travel back to Perth. The Joneses were planning to pick up Alan again when they docked in Sydney 2 weeks later, and he would remain on board with them for the rest of the trip. Rana Lee Jones also left the boat at Port Lincoln because she had her own work commitments to attend to back in Perth. A few days later, the boat arrived in Portland, where Ken radioed Alan and let him know that he needed money to buy fuel, so the money was wired and withdrawn. While they were docked, Michael Calvin phoned his parents to let him know that he was looking forward to visiting them soon. He also took the opportunity to mail a letter to his twin sister, letting her know about his plans to visit the family over Christmas and start up a charter business sometime after the new year. Michael ended the letter by writing, "We have just made a message in a bottle for a free holiday aboard the Patanela." On November 5th, one day after the boat left Portland, Michael's father received a call from his son on the radio. Michael apparently said, "Good day, Dad," before the line suddenly went dead and there would be no more further communication from him. In spite of this, there would be 2 more separate calls where Ken radioed in his position on the 5th and the 6th. Sometime on November 7th, a lighthouse keeper at Point Perpendicular saw the Patanela, but this would turn out to be the last known sighting of the boat. At around 12:57 a.m. on November 8th, a radio operator at the Overseas Telecommunications Commission received a call from Ken Jones, who said the Patanela was currently 10 nautical miles east from Botany Bay in Sydney, which is over 1,900 kilometers south of Airlie Beach. His exact communication was, "I believe we've run out of fuel. We've hoisted our sails and we're tacking out to the east, tracking about 080. Our intention is to tack out for a couple of hours, then tack back in. We may need some assistance in the morning to get back into Sydney Harbour." Ken apparently did not sound panicked at all, and the communication ended until Ken called back in 1 hour later. He asked for a weather report and requested directions to the town of Moruya. This sounded strange, as Moruya was located on the coast of New South Wales. It was about 300 kilometers south of Botany Bay and would take several hours to reach. This was not a logical direction for a ship that had run out of fuel and was only 10 nautical miles away from shore. After the operator provided Ken with the directions and warned him there was some strong wind in the area, he signed off again. But a couple of minutes later there would be another call from the Patanela. This time, the operator heard a bunch of static on the line, so Ken's voice was difficult to understand. All that could be deciphered were the words, 300 kilometers south? Is it? South? The line quickly went dead, and there would be no more communications from the Patanela. Neither the boat, nor any of its 4 passengers, were ever heard from again. Initially, there wasn't much cause for concern, as the Overseas Telecommunications Commission just assumed that Ken had changed his mind about sailing towards Botany Bay and just gone elsewhere. But they never made arrangements to pick up Alan Nicol from Sydney. The Patanela had been scheduled to arrive in Airlie Beach on November 18th, and Alan's family was waiting there for them, but the boat never showed up. Concern escalated when Ken Jones's son Peter revealed that he tried to contact his father several times over the radio, but had not spoken with him in over a week. So a full alert was sounded, and a search effort was launched to find the Patanela, but it failed to turn up any trace of the boat or any wreckage. The obvious solution was that the Patanela had sunk to the bottom of the ocean, and if it sank at the location Ken Jones cited, 10 nautical miles east of Botany Bay, then it probably would have been impossible to find, since the water there was 140 meters deep. However, there were some troubling unanswered questions. No one could figure out why Ken Jones had requested directions to Moruya, 300 kilometers south. Even if the boat hadn't run out of fuel, Moruya was in the complete opposite direction of Airlie Beach, his ultimate destination. Not to mention, why had the Patanela run out of fuel in the first place? Alan Nicol claimed that the boat's 3,500-litre tanks were completely full when it left Fremantle, and they'd picked up some additional diesel at stops along the way. Now, Ken did radio Alan and asked him to wire money for fuel several days earlier while the boat was docked in Portland. The money was received, though no one could be completely certain if it was used to purchase fuel. If the tanks were filled up in Portland, could the boat have run out of fuel in the amount of time it took to travel from there to Botany Bay? Barring some unforeseen disaster, like a ruptured gas tank, that didn't seem likely. Also, the Patanela was pretty much equipped for any contingency. It had radar, satellite navigation, and an emergency radio beacon which could be detected by passing aircraft, but there was no indication that this beacon was ever turned on. The yacht also had lifeboats if they ever needed to abandon ship, but those were never found either, and once again, Ken had claimed they were only 10 nautical miles away from shore. There was also skepticism about whether the Patanela was even capable of just sinking to the bottom of the ocean and disappearing, as it was made of steel and had several watertight compartments. If it sank, it likely would have been due to a major collision with another vessel. However, investigators checked into 48 vessels which were known to be in the area on the night the Patanela disappeared, and none of them showed any signs of damage or being involved in a collision. And if there was a collision, how come no wreckage or debris could be found? An interesting development occurred on May 9, 1989, when a fisherman discovered a life buoy off the coast of Terrigal. It had the words Patanela Fremantle written on it. However, this only heightened the mystery. Terrigal was located over 100 kilometers north of Botany Bay, the Patanela's last known location. A marine biologist performed tests on the life buoy and concluded that it couldn't have been in the water for longer than 4 weeks, even though the boat had been missing for 6 months at this point. Alan Nicol also confirmed that this life buoy had been hooked very securely to the boat, and found it unlikely that it could have just fallen off accidentally. Initially, at least, Alan wondered if Ken had decided to rip him off by stealing his boat, or using it for criminal activity, such as drug smuggling. The strange inconsistencies made people speculate that the Patanela might have been the victim of a hijacking, but if the boat was actually stolen, what became of it? Like many cases involving missing boats, there were numerous reported sightings of the Patanela at various locations throughout the years, but none of them ever checked out. In 1992, a coroner's inquest was held into the matter, and since there was no evidence to support a hijacking, the only conclusion they could reach was that the Patanela was the victim of an accidental sinking, possibly after a collision with a larger vessel. However, there would be a surprising postscript to this story. On New Year's Eve in 2007, a woman found a rum bottle washed up on the shore of an isolated beach near Eucla. It was half buried in the sand, and it had a message inside of it. To their surprise, the message had been written by John Blissett, one of the missing crew members from the Patanela. It read, "Hi there. Out here on the lonely Southern Ocean and thought we would give away a free holiday in the Whitsunday Islands in North Queensland, Australia. Our ship is travelling from Fremantle, Western Australia, to Queensland to work as a charter vessel." It then provided a phone number and stated that the finder of this message could call the number to claim their prize. It also provided the current location of the boat at the time the message was written, before it concluded, "See you soon." The woman who discovered the bottle eventually got in contact with John Blissette's family. She sent them a photo of the note, and they confirmed that it was his handwriting. The note was dated October 26, 1988, 10 days after the Patanela began its voyage, but nearly 2 weeks before its last communication. It had no bearing on the boat's disappearance, and was intended as nothing more than a light-hearted joke, but it still came across as an eerie message from the grave. Even though the story brought the Patanela back into the spotlight again, there would still be no answers about what actually happened to it. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before I begin my analysis, here's a quick word about our sponsor. The Trail Went Cold wants to express our deepest thanks to Audible for supporting this podcast. Audible has an unmatched selection of audiobooks, original shows, news, comedy, and so much more. Much like our podcast, their audiobooks are great to listen to in so many different situations, such as driving or getting stuck in traffic, working around the house, shopping, working out at the gym, or, as in my own daily experience, taking a long bus ride to and from work. Audible is currently offering you, our audience, a free audiobook with a 30-day free trial. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. Just go to audible.com/cold and browse their unmatched selection of audio content. All you have to do is download a title for free and start listening. It's that easy. And as listeners of our podcast, you'll be very happy to know that they've got an excellent selection of true crime books. I have just personally downloaded and started listening to an audiobook titled The Injustice System, A Murder in Miami and a Trial Gone Wrong. If you liked our 2-part podcast episode about the Tommy Ziegler case, then you'll probably enjoy this book, as it chronicles another controversial death penalty case from the state of Florida. It tells the story of Chris Maharaj, a man who was sentenced to death for a pair of murders he may not have actually committed. The author is Clyde Stafford Smith, the public defender who took on this case and uncovered evidence to suggest his client might be innocent. It is a harrowing but riveting story of a case which has still not reached full resolution after 30 years and exposes the fallibility of the legal system. The Injustice System, A Murder and Trial in Miami Gone Wrong, is highly recommended for true crime fans like yourself. So remember, to get a free audiobook like this one with a 30-day free trial, please go to audible.com/cold. That's audible.com/cold. Thank you very much. Yes, this is definitely one of the more baffling mysteries I've seen involving a missing boat, and I do wonder if there's a lot more to this story than a simple sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Here's some historical context about how tough it would be to sink the Patanela. In 1958, the boat collided with a submerged rock off the Tasmanian coast, ripping open a hole in its hull which was 1.5 meters long. Yet in spite of this, it still managed to make a 200-kilometer journey to the nearest port. While no evidence was found to suggest the Patanela had collided with any other vessels in the area, one popular theory is it collided with a Russian submarine on a spying mission. That sounds pretty over the top, but I do think that if there was an accidental collision, the responsible vessel must have fled the area and managed to avoid being checked by investigators. The big issue is that the Patanela was not reported missing until 10 days after its last communication, and any number of things could have happened during that time. Of course, another popular theory is that hijackers took over the Patanela, killed everyone on board, stole the vessel, and then decided to refit it and rename it so that it would never be recognized. Now, the coroner's inquest concluded that the most likely explanation was that the ship had sank after an accidental collision because there was no evidence of a hijacking or anything to suggest the boat had been stolen. And from a technical standpoint, I can't really disagree with the ruling. With no confirmed sightings of the Patanela, the only logical conclusion they could reach was that it had to be at the bottom of the ocean somewhere and just wasn't found. But on the other hand, they never found any wreckage or debris, and the only remnant of the Patanela which has ever turned up is a life buoy. So technically, there is also no evidence that the Patanela was involved in a collision and sank, but a lack of evidence doesn't really mean anything if the boat might be 140 meters below the water. Even though there is no direct evidence of a hijacking, that does not necessarily mean one didn't happen. Ken Jones's son Peter listened to the recordings of his father's radio transmissions from the night of the boat's disappearance. Peter became convinced that Ken might have been under duress and was making veiled calls for help. He was troubled by the wording Ken used, as he didn't say, "We've run out of fuel," and instead said, "I believe we've run out of fuel." Peter thought that a skipper as experienced as his father would not be so unsure if he had run out of fuel. Furthermore, Ken should have known that the most logical solution for running out of fuel would be to drop an anchor and send out a call for help. It's not like they were out in the middle of the ocean somewhere. If they were only 10 nautical miles east of Botany Bay, then lights from the shore would have been visible to them, and the boat should have been very easy to find. And no one can think of any logical reason Ken would have asked for directions to Maruya, 300 kilometers in the opposite direction. It's also quite strange that there was a large amount of static in Ken's final communication before he was cut off. Even if Ken could no longer communicate via the radio, he still could have switched on the emergency radio beacon to signal for help, yet as far as anyone can tell, he never did. And like I mentioned earlier, it seemed unlikely that Ken could have run out of fuel at this location if he filled up in Portland. But we cannot be 100% certain if the money Alan Nickel wired to him was actually used to purchase fuel. Some people have theorized that hijackers might have forced Ken to radio in a false location, so that when searchers eventually came looking for them, they would end up searching in the wrong area. It's worth noting that the last known sighting of the Patanela occurred on November 7th from a lighthouse in Port Perpendicular, which is located over 200 kilometers south of Botany Bay. Unfortunately, I've been unable to find out the exact time this alleged sighting took place. We know that Ken made his first radio call at 12:57 a.m. on November 8th, so it would be interesting to determine if he would have had enough time to travel from Point Perpendicular to a location near Botany Bay by then. The discovery of the life buoy 100 kilometers north near Terrigal only adds more complications. Since it seemed unlikely that it could have fallen off the boat accidentally, one possible theory is that someone tossed it overboard as a signal for help. But then there was the marine biologist's conclusion that the life buoy could have only been in the water for 4 weeks. If that's true, then where was the Patanela during the other 5 months it was missing? Well, I won't rule out the possibility that the marine biologist's conclusion might have been wrong. I read an old newspaper article which mentioned that the fisherman who originally pulled the life buoy out of the water cleaned it off because it was covered with barnacles, and it was feared that he had unknowingly destroyed crucial evidence. So by the time the marine biologist finally examined the life buoy, the test he performed on it might have been flawed. It's possible he took all these things into account when he performed the tests, but I can't rule out the possibility that his conclusions were inaccurate, and that the life buoy was actually in the water for longer than 4 weeks. But if the Patanela was out there on the coast of New South Wales 5 months after it originally disappeared, then I'd wager it was in disguise under a different name, which would explain why someone might dispose of a life buoy featuring the Patanela's name. Another unexplained element to this story is the abbreviated radio call Michael Calvin made to his father 3 days before the Patanela went missing. Up until this point, Michael had only communicated with his family by telephone and never attempted to contact them by radio. Since the call was abruptly cut off, why didn't Michael attempt to contact his father again? We know that Ken used the radio on multiple occasions after this, so it's not like it was broken. This suggests that something might have happened on that boat shortly after Michael's call, lending credence to the theory that Ken's final radio communications 3 days later were made under duress. When John Blissette's message in a bottle was found 19 years later, it didn't shed any light on what actually happened, but John's family and Michael's family both thought its discovery did a lot to help clear their names. Right from the outset, it was theorized that John and Michael might have been directly involved in the hijacking of the boat. Admittedly, when I initially started researching this case, and read that they had approached Alan Nickel and he gave them jobs as crew members on the Patanela just like that, I became suspicious. Here are 2 guys that Alan and Ken and his family barely knew, and they were just going to be allowed to tag along on a 1-month boat trip. I can see why some people thought the ship's disappearance might have been an elaborate setup orchestrated by Blissett and Calvin, but I think the message in the bottle seems to cast doubt on that. It just seems very unlikely that John would write this light-hearted note and throw it into the ocean if he was planning something sinister later on. And Michael's final phone call to his parents and his final letter to his sister seem to indicate the same thing. Both these guys seem to be very close to their families and had big plans for the future. If there was a hijacking on the Patanela, then it's unlikely that either of them were involved. I also initially had a few suspicions about Alan Nicol, since he conveniently disembarked from the Patanela before it went missing. However, it sounds like Alan was one of the first people to push forward the idea that the boat had been stolen or hijacked. If he was involved, I think he would have preferred people to believe that the boat simply sank. He also spent over $30,000 of his own money on search efforts to find the Patanela, which seems like an unlikely thing to do if he knew for a fact that it never would be found. Whatever happened, I'm inclined to think that none of the 6 original passengers on the Patanela were directly responsible for the boat's disappearance. In these type of stories, I'm ordinarily inclined to believe the simplest explanation. The boat simply sank to the bottom of the ocean. Yet the only piece of evidence to ever surface is a life buoy found 100 kilometers away from its last known location. So I think there is some merit to the hijacking theory, and that the boat could have been stolen, refitted, and renamed. Maybe the Patanela has been out there in plain view all along without anyone knowing it. But if the Patanela did sink, then something had to cause it. If it was a collision with another vessel, whoever was responsible did not stick around to face the consequences, and got away with causing the deaths of 4 innocent people. I won't rule out the possibility that the whole thing was just a tragic accident, and no one is at fault, but I have my suspicions that there was someone out there who caused the Patanela's disappearance and has never been held accountable for it. If that's the case, then finding out who they are might be the only chance we have at solving this baffling mystery. So if you have any information about the fate of the Patanela or its 4 missing passengers, Ken Jones, Noreen Jones, John Blissett, and Michael Calvin, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thank you to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. And if you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.